Yes, I've always wanted to be a writer. I think probably from a very young age I was kind of aware that, I like telling stories, and I did that kind of really classic thing that kids do, I think, of kind of going off in a little world on my own and sort of referring to myself in the third person, but only in my head. I've heard some people do it out loud. I didn't do it out loud, but I would do that thing of like, she sat on the stairs and was in a terrible mood, kind of internal monologue almost to myself of what was going on. But then got to university and did the, English literature degree, and kind of lost my nerve really, because, I mean, it's a kind of classic thing, isn't it? You go and you read all these incredible books and you think, how dare I even set pen to paper. Well, I started, I think, about, well, let's think, I did a creative writing MA starting in 2001, because I'd just sort of got to I've been working in telly, actually, in a really small documentary company, which was lovely, but I'd sort of got into it by accident and, didn't love it enough, I think, to kind of really make a career of it. And I thought, well, I probably should go and, do this writing thing and really try that out. But, how am I going to do it on my own? Because it just seemed like this kind of massive mountain to climb, really, just to sort of sit there and suddenly produce a novel on your own, which is, of course, what writers do. But, but to me, not having written anything for a long time, it just seemed an incredibly scary and impossible thing to do, really. So I thought, well, perhaps I should go and do a course in creative writing. And I think at the time I was kind of in two minds about whether that would work or whether you could even teach creative writing. But I thought, well, I'll go and give this a go, because I knew that I just sort of needed some support and guidance. So I went along in 2001 and started an MA in creative writing at Chichester University. That was a part-time MA, so it actually went on for 3 years, which I think kind of gave me the time to kind of build up the confidence to actually keep doing it, and do it and sort of think of it seriously as well, and kind of, begin to think, well, actually, perhaps I could write a novel. When I started writing it, it was actually a radio play, in all these different voices. So it had about kind of 8 different voices or something, and it was very focused on the murder itself in a way that the novel isn't. And it was sort of quite a nice little radio play, but it was a bit sort of, looking back on it, it was kind of a bit hysterical, I think, But I think that the good thing about writing it as a radio play was that I'd got very into the voices and kind of hearing the voices in my head, and that helped me with the two narrators of Howard and Joanna. That helped me a lot. Well, with the Pauls, because I was writing about the 80s, obviously I remember the 80s very well. Having been a teenager in the 80s, that was a kind of, very sort of formative period in my life. So I think I was just drawn to that time. Like a lot of first novelists, I wanted to write about, growing up, and how I grew up in a way. Although, I'm kind of not in the book. I am in the book, of course, because, it's the time and the place, when I grew up. That felt very different in a way to writing about the 30s for the second book, The Good Plain Cook, which is obviously something I don't remember, so I did have to go and do quite a lot of research. I knew that I wanted to write about Peggy Guggenheim, first of all. And I sort of thought that it would be set in the 50s, because that's when Peggy moved to Venice. And, that's when you have all the kind of wonderful thing of her living in her palazzo on the Grand Canal. And I thought, how wonderful to write about that, And that's also, when she's quite famous, and, she's got a lot of kind of people coming to visit her, and, her collection is up and running, and, all those things. Then it just went off at a tangent, because I found out all this stuff that, earlier in her life she'd lived in Sussex, which is, where I live, and that she'd lived in this little cottage with a poet who was useless, and and that she'd had this cook who was also useless, and all these things just were suddenly much more interesting to me than the kind of the glamour of Venice somehow. On our wedding night she wore a very different nightie. It was all layers of stuff, a bit see-through, short, well above her knees, but it hung there as if it wasn't on her body at all. as if she'd just stepped into a teepee made of nylon. "What's that you're wearing?" I said, smiling, wishing I could see more of her lovely curves. At the power station Christmas parties, I knew the other men were watching her, their eyes following her movements. Some of them even looked slightly scared if she spoke to them. I noticed that. They would lean towards her to catch her voice. They patted other women on the hips, shouted things out as they passed, but with Catherine it wasn't like that. Even her hair seemed curvy to me, and her eyelashes, the way they swept up off her cheeks, just as women's eyelashes are supposed to. I never saw any other girl with eyelashes like Catherine's, except at the pictures. On our wedding night she touched a layer of nylon and gave me a twirl. "It's a powder blue negligee," she said. "Can't you tell?" And she lifted up the hem and laughed.